Here in January of 2013, and I like to say that I moved here in the dark ages because what I began to understand was that this was a radically different Kansas than it had historically been. And I started doing activism work here, first with the Equality House on LGBT rights and other things, but one thing that really stuck with me from the beginning is that everyone I was meeting, if it was just having small talk in a coffee shop, talking to the cashier at a gas station, the friends I was making, everyone seemed so different than the dominant politics of the state. I met almost no one who agreed with what was happening, and I started to wonder, how did we get here? Why is it like this? Why am I meeting no one that supports this agenda? Before I get into this, though, I want to take a step back really quick, kind of take a deep breath and appreciate how far we've come as a system of government over the last several hundred years. Think about our capacity now to make change without violence. To me personally, on a religious and spiritual level, democracy and the system of government we have is the opportunity to decide our future without having to resort to violence. And that is an amazing thing, but it is something that we have to constantly work to improve, to better realize, because there are still so many people that feel like they cannot have their issues addressed without resorting to violence. So the work of building a better democracy, of building a better government, is about being able to include other people so they can have a nonviolent pathway to have their grievances addressed. So, the people. This is supposed to be in the Kansas Constitution and the U.S. Constitution. It's all supposed to be based on the will of the people is the government, but it doesn't seem that way. There are a couple things that make it difficult for people to be involved in politics. The most important of which is living your life. It's really difficult to keep up with the news, to keep up with the nuance of how complicated the policy process can be, to understand what's the truth in the news, which I know is Jason Probst was going to be talking about or already talked about, I'm not sure. But it's really difficult to be engaged right now because we're trying to live our increasingly complicated lives while dealing with an increasingly complicated political policy-making system. But also we have very limited education on how this system works. I actually found a 1940s civics textbook from Kansas, and it was amazing. It read like a community organizer guide today, and this was basic curriculum in Kansas in the 40s. The death of civic education is one of the biggest threats to our democracy, in my opinion. Understanding American government is not the same as civics. And the fact that we've conflated the idea of understanding the structures of things with what it means to be a good citizen, those are completely different things. Being a good citizen, a good community member is not the same as understanding the structures of government. With that though, Kansas has a missing electorate. The whole country does, but Kansas is really, really missing a certain electorate, and it's young people. So here is what the population looks like in Kansas. On the bottom there, you see that it's every year of age, starting at 18, going to 85. And this might be a little bit shocking because you probably don't think of Kansas as an especially young state, but it is. Most people here are young people in the state. We're actually a young nation. Millennials are the largest bloc right now. But it doesn't feel that way because young people aren't engaged in civics. They don't exist in our civic life. This is what turnout looked like in 2016. To me, this is the most concerning thing in our democracy right now. And whenever we talk about apathy, when we talk about issues not being addressed, it's obvious why certain issues aren't addressed. A huge chunk of our population isn't involved in the process. A good rule of thumb is actually your age is about your statistical chance of voting. 20-year-olds vote about 20% of the time, 70-year-olds vote about 70% of the time. So, and actually one thing that's interesting is you see 18 years old, right there you see a little peak. through this, and I don't have this graph set up, but what you can generally see is every presidential year, you see a peak in voter registration and turnout that goes on for generations. It continues throughout history. If you turned 18 in a presidential year, whenever there was such a culture of political engagement, you're more likely to stay involved your entire life. This is also worth noting because I turned 18 in the 2008 election, one of the most exciting elections in our nation, and I don't think that it's a complete coincidence that I'm super involved in civics when that lined up that way. One thing that's especially unique about millennials is they are actually more cohesive in political preference than political parties. When we talk about issues like transitioning to renewable energy, creating a pathway to citizenship, creating universal pre-K, police reform, criminal justice reform, overwhelmingly, people under 35 are united on their policy preference of those things. It's also the most racially diverse generation in the history of a nation of the world. Party affiliation, over half of young people don't agree with identifying with either party. They're unaffiliated. In religious composition, it's also the most diverse. And one of my favorite things about this is that whenever asked other measures of spirituality, measures of do you believe in doing altruistic good and helping others and changing a system to be more generous to the poor, young people actually are more aligned. Non-religious identifying people tend to be more aligned with those values than strongly religiously identifying people. So this is the racial makeup of Kansas by year of age. And as you can see, if you're over about 74, you grew up in a generation that about over 90% of people around you are white, if you're in Kansas. But now you get down to when you're under about 26, 27 years old, and less than 70% of the people you grew up around were white. So I'm 28 years old. In 6th grade, I remember whenever one of my good friends, we were learning about Social Security numbers, and she told me that her Social Security number was made up because she wasn't here legally. And then she all of a sudden started panicking. She was like, wait, you can't tell anyone or my family will be deported. That's part of the reason that there's such a generational divide too on immigration issues. What so many people are calling illegal immigrants, my generation calls best friend, spouse. That is the community that we grew up in. But again, because of that huge divide, that feeling, that experience isn't represented in the government. So this is that first graph compressed a little bit, but this also includes registration. The light red is there in registration. And again, I just think this is the most shocking, disturbing thing and should be one of the government's top priorities. How do we change this to bring this generation into the electoral process? Now the politicians. What kind of people run for office? Think about that. What kind of person decides they're going to run for office? You already probably have some stereotypes about that. But now consider this. In Kansas, legislators make about $10,000. And in their per diem, it's about $10,000 more. So for their yearly pay, it's about $20,000. Most people cannot do that. Actually, it's impossible for anyone to live like any remotely decent standard of living on that wage. I've had so many conversations with people who really care, are really brilliant, would make excellent politicians, legislators, and they cannot run because their family cannot afford for them to run. This limits the pool of who is allowed to run, which often looks like folks who are retired, where that's a great, important group to be represented, but it shouldn't be a requirement for being in the legislature. It also often looks like legislators who are basically professional lobbyists. They have some part-time job at some corporation that's paying them a check to do some random title, but really what they're doing is they're a legislator who's being paid basically as a lobbyist, and what's better than a lobbyist than just paying a legislator? It creates a very, very questionable system of the type of people who become legislators. The other thing is the strain that our toxic political environment puts on families. I have watched I was good friends with a family, and I watched a political campaign several years ago end in a divorce, and there are 3 kids involved. And I had to watch that whole process happen because random rumors that ended up ultimately not being true went up in the media, and it just hurt this family. And it's such a strain for already working American families. It's so hard for them already, and then having the strain of having your family dragged through the mud, often on false accusations in the paper. You actually have to be kind of crazy to run for office. In Kansas especially, where we're in the bottom 5 for pay, by the way. It's not like that in every state. We are in the bottom 5. It's amazing how many bottom 5s we are in right now. We're also in the bottom 5 for youth turnout in the nation. Then there's the whole part of the things you do hear about. You know about gerrymandering. You know how the dominant party gets to draw the political boundaries. And often in so many districts, there's not really a race. The politicians have picked who gets to vote for them, so the outcome's already decided. Many of the races, the outcome's already decided. Actually, nearly half of our races go unopposed. No one even challenges them. So they never even have to answer for what they've done. Also, many of them are won by less than 1,000 votes, again making this so startling that such a large part of our population isn't represented. So I'm going to go back real fast, and let's look at what party has dominated Kansas politics. This is since in 1992. In 1991 was the last year that Kansas had its legislature was split, where the House was controlled by one representative. The House was controlled by the Democrats. The Senate has been controlled by Republicans since 1930-something, nearly 100 years. The Senate has been controlled by Republicans in Kansas. But even throughout the 90s, you talked to a lot of legislators, and there was a different vibe. There was an attitude of bipartisanship. There wasn't as extreme ideology on either side. But then we get to the point where really after 2008 and really 2010 was a huge pivotal moment where American politics became wildly toxic for everyone involved. And this was whenever both chambers in the Kansas legislature became not Republican controlled, but super majority trifecta far-right Republican government. Even if you are a conservative Republican, no form of government should go unchallenged. Ideas need to be debated. I don't believe in either side having a supermajority control because ideas should have to be proven on the debate floor and shouldn't be able to just be shoved through. But then in 2012, also, this is whenever Republicans turned against Republicans and we saw kind of the rise of the far right, and it's called the Purge. And in the Purge was when Brownback and other folks like him went around the state and actually ousted more traditional, moderate, sensible Republicans and created a really extreme government. So this is how we ended up getting the Brownback tax experiment. It was actually a huge political miscalculation. It was originally supposed to be paid for in a certain way that got pulled out, so it just became this huge debt-generating process that you're going to hear about soon. But it was just a real disaster. And actually, Brownback didn't think it was a good idea either. Brownback was in the paper saying, well, we're probably going to find a way to offset it later. The plan was always to now fix it, but they never did. They just created a huge tax cut, and they created no way to pay for it, and nothing else changed, so it created massive debt. And that's the kind of thing that happens whenever you have such a one-sided government, is even ideas that they think are stupid somehow get passed and get shoved through because of someone's interest. And this is also where political interest and money comes into it. Over 90% of the time, the candidate who raises the most money wins. Over 90% of the time. But the thing is, money doesn't vote. People vote. So money's only power is to influence what you think. There are really great stories that I've heard traveling around the state of, city council races where all these nasty mailers come out of a candidate, but everyone in town knows that person. So you can laugh off the toxic mailer because the money doesn't work because the community is so strong. and people know that person, so they can't believe the nonsense that they get in the mail. But that's not the case in most places, and it's definitely not the case on a statewide level. There's a reason that all you see on TV is political ads. It's because they're effective. They're really effective. They change people's votes, and they come from certain money and interest. And that money comes with strings attached. People know what lobbyists they need to listen to in order to get that money next election cycle. And that creates a really big problem when we now consider that less than, let me see, I'm going to quote this exactly. I think it is, 0.02% of income earners in the United States contribute over 2/3 of the money to the political process, most of it being dark hidden money that no one can calculate who it came from. So you have a tiny, 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 tiny fraction of the population having an absorbent amount of control over what politicians do, because the politicians then, you can be an awful politician. And if someone dumps enough money into you, you can win. Actually, in political science, we write equations for how much money it would take for anyone to win. You can pretty much take anybody and make a formula for how much money it would take for them to become president. It might be a whole lot of money, but there's a formula and there's a way where if you put enough ad space out there, if you put enough money into someone, anyone can win with enough money. So that's also the problem. I mean, when we think about who can run for governor, you have to be able to raise millions of dollars. When we even think about people who can run for state representative, which are only supposed to represent a small community when you're a state representative, you have to be able to raise at least $20,000. But realistically, if it's a competitive district, you need to be able to raise like $50,000. What kind of working class person is able to raise $50,000 just because they want to run to represent their small town? That's a really broken system, and there's a lot of broken parts to it. This is what the legislature looks like about right now when we break it down, where we have far-right Republicans, traditional moderate Republicans, and Democrats. Just a kind of preview of what will happen in 2019 is it will look, at least the legislature will look about the same. There's a decent chance that Democrats might pick up a couple seats, but moderate Republicans lost a couple seats. And so when you think about this, we're about in the same boat that we're in right now, which is, again, better than when the Brownback tax experiment passed, but it's certainly not the greatest check and balance going on there. So now the policy. So even if you're really engaged in politics and you care about it, you follow it, you might even knock doors, you're involved, you probably completely zone out and have no clue what's going on in the policy process. And the kind of like unspoken truth is neither does your legislator. No one really knows what's going on in the state house. No one. Seriously, no one knows what's going on. There are competing interests, and every day you walk around and things usually nothing is happening until everything happens really quick. And that is not a good way to govern. And it creates a lot of really bad policy. Like objectively, like no one there agrees that this process is effective because you have months of them sitting around kind of talking about some bills that will never go anywhere, and then all of a sudden it gets to the last minute and everything really important gets slammed through. This is from the state's website. This is how a bill becomes a law, which is in itself already, probably pretty boring looking and pretty much inaccurate. The whole, I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only Bill, I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill is not really how the process works. Like maybe formally it's kind of the direction that it has to go in, but let's like start with who writes a bill. It's not usually legislators that write bills. Bills are written by lobbyists. Bills are written by special interests, which is something you're going to hear about in a minute, but it's legislators don't write bills. They really don't. It is usually someone shows up, a special interest. Sometimes that's a good special interest that you might agree with. Oftentimes it's a special interest you probably disagree with, but they present the bills, and then a legislator puts his name on it. And then because Kansas is how it is, usually no one even knows who presented that bill because we're considered one of the darkest legislative processes in the nation, where it's actually impossible to track who made up a bill. So all this goes through too, and if there's a problem, everyone can distance themselves from it, or everyone can attach their name to it if they like it, because you don't know where it came from. So that's part of the problem. But once the bill's introduced, there are basically a very, very, very small number of legislators who decide if bills pass or not. And they are mostly people like committee chairs, which are basically little unelected dictators. But really, they can do, when you think of the governor having the power to veto, there's something called a pocket veto, that if you're in a committee chair, you can have a bill come to your committee and you can make sure that it never, ever gets a hearing. No one's even allowed to talk about it because you just put it in your dress drawer and forget about it. Bills die every day in the legislature because someone convinces a committee chair just to put it in their drawer and walk away from it. Now, if it does somehow make it to the committee, then you have to make it to the floor. And again, if it's allowed to make it to the floor, it's decided by the leadership of the majority party. So it's decided by the Speaker of the House, the President, or often by the majority leaders in either of those chambers. Now, if it gets there and if it somehow does end up passing, then it has to go over to the other side and go through the entirely same process. Often bills do make it through one side and you hear like, it passed the House, this bill that's so common sense and we all agree with, but then you never hear about it again. And you might even think that it passed because you saw the big media shiny headline saying it passed the House, but then actually it just went over to the Senate chamber and it went into committee and it's sitting in a dress drawer and nothing happens with it. There's not a perfect solution. A lot of it is we need way more transparency. They're starting to have more cameras in committee rooms. I just got in a disagreement a couple weeks ago with a state senator who was like, I didn't do that. And I was able to pull up the committee minutes. And I was like, yeah, you did. But part of it means that we all have to step up. We really do. I've gone from just a community activist running around screaming at the top of my lungs about issues to starting to show up in the legislature, understanding how the process works, and getting involved. And this is really where on all of these things, it's about power. Think about the power that you have to change each of these things. When we talk about people, and particularly that missing electorate of young people, but there's also missing electorates of disabled folks. It's very hard if you have a permanent disability making you immobile to participate in our system. So registering, turning out, engaging in conversation, those folks. Also, now you can go to ksvotes.org, and as of, I think, last night, you can now apply for advanced ballots online at ksvotes.org, which is amazing. And that is a great way to get people engaged, but really having those conversations, starting to center your relationships around political power, around community change. For politicians, you have to support good politicians. You have to encourage people to run. It is hard on their life. It is hard on their family. It is very difficult to do this whole process. Like supporting them doesn't just mean knocking doors. It also means being emotional support for them, helping them, being their friend through this process. And then it also means calling out bad politicians, showing up at those meetings, not just to say, screw you, but showing up with an argument that points out the absurdity of what they did and how it's hurting your community. And then for policy, become a citizen lobbyist. Most people pay attention when the election's going on. November is not the most important moment when bills are made. The most important moment is often February and March when no one's paying attention. It's when these bills are in committee, it's when they're on the House floor. That's the moment where a single vote of you calling up your representative and saying, I really care about it for these reasons, or you showing up in the State House can completely transform the process. So I think that's about my time, but please exercise your power in this whole process. It's really broken, but it's not as bad as it seems. In a lot of ways of fixing it, the path is pretty clear. So get engaged, exercise your power, register people to vote, show up in the policy process, help good politicians get elected, but then also show up and push for the policies you want to see in the State House. Thank you all so much.